Educators should get back to educating kids. That's what they should do. And when the emphasis is on equity, that disadvantage everybody. We should be striving for equal opportunity. In other words, American education is failing all children, regardless of race and regardless of income. So we're saying that we should measure our success not against races, but against a standard of excellence from 0 to 100. And so we're trying to get us back to where we used to be in America, where we emphasize character.
Welcome to Homeschool Talks, a podcast by HSLDA. This is a show about all things homeschooling, from practical tips to inspiring stories and everything in between. We're so glad you've joined us today, and we hope you enjoy the program.
Hello, my name is Jim Mason. I'm Vice President at Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and I'm really excited to talk to my next guest, Robert Woodson, who is the founder and president of the Woodson Center in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Bob.
Pleased to be here, Jim.
So you've had a long and distinguished career, and I think our listeners would really like to hear from you how you became the Bob Woodson you are today and how you got into the work you're doing now.
Well, without going into laborious detail, I'm born and raised in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, low-income Black neighborhood during the Depression, segregated community. Dad died when I was 9, leaving my mother fifth grade education to raise 5 children, and dropped out of high school at 17, went into the military, found myself there, got redirected, grew up and finished my GED, came out and worked full time and got a degree for the historically Black college, and then got a full scholarship at the University of Penn School of Social Work, and got involved in the civil rights movement. As a young civil rights leader, realized that a lot of people who suffered and sacrificed didn't benefit from the change, that a lot of the benefits, once the doors of opportunity open, were not accruing to low-income Blacks. And so I began to move from there to work on behalf of low-income people of all races. And so that got me to the American Enterprise Institute. I worked at the national level, helping low-income leaders develop self-help solutions from within those communities. And I began to have differences with the civil rights movement on the issues of forced busing for integration, affirmative action, and now race grievance. It has morphed into a race grievance industry. So my organization, the Woodson Center, has pioneered and working on behalf of low-income people of all races to help them develop solutions to their problems by developing the resources from within that community. So our solutions come from the inside out and the bottom up.
So you first came to my attention a couple of weeks ago when I read an article by the historian Wilfred McCoy, who with Hillsdale College has developed a curriculum called the 1776 curriculum. And in that article, and this is why I think you'll be, you're a fascinating guest for homeschooling parents. In Professor McClay's article, he referred to the project that the Woodson Center is currently rolling out that you call 1776 Unites. Tell us about that.
Well, it was really in response to the New York Times' 1619 project, spearheaded by Nicole Hannah-Jones, one of its Black journalists, where she gathered a group of Black journalists and others. And they released a series of essays called 1619. And what they were saying is that America's birthday should be 1619, when the first 20 African slaves arrived. And they went on and gave, I think, a false narrative about American history. And then claimed that as a consequence of the slavery, America should be forever tainted and defined by slavery, and that all white people are villains, and that all white Blacks are victims. And that gave rise to critical race theory. And since they were using the rich legacy of the civil rights movement like a parasite on it, as a bludgeon against the country's values. We thought that the messengers, the counter messengers, should also be Black-led. And so I got together about 20 scholars and activists, and we put together our own response, and we said that America's legitimate birthday is 1776, and we wanted to not to offer a counter argument, but to offer a counter inspirational and aspirational narrative that refutes the fundamental premise that the problems facing large swaths of Black America today are somehow the consequence or legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, and that is just not true. So our essays provide evidence that when whites were at their worst, Blacks were at their best, that America should never be defined by its birth defect of slavery, that America should be defined as a nation of redemption, a nation of second chances.
So the 1776 Unites curriculum can be found at 1776unites.com. Tell us how you came to develop these lessons and what's their focus, and how can homeschooling parents benefit from them?
Well, again, the basic premise of the 1619 is that America is incurably racist, and therefore Blacks should be always viewed as suffering from that legacy. And in our curriculum, we go into, for instance, that to refute that. And we give examples of how Blacks achieved against the odds. And there are some valuable lessons from their resilience and achieving against the odds. They're valuable lessons for everybody to see how only in America there are 20 Blacks who were born slaves who had died millionaires. So we tell the story of Biddy Mason, a woman who was born in 1818 in Mississippi, walked behind a wagon 1,000 miles to Salt Lake City with 3 children. And eventually he moved to California, and Biddy Mason was a midwife and saved her $1.50 a day and became a millionaire. Well, and became a philanthropist, and she helped all people. So we think, and there are other stories of how the education gap in the South between 1920 and 1940 was closed from 8th grade for 3 years to 6 months because of the establishment of 5,000 Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington schools. And so what's important, if the Black community could close the education gap between 1920 and 1940 in the midst of Jim Crow, where they had crowded classrooms, a fraction of the budgets of white schools, used textbooks, why can't we close the education gap today? It really challenges this notion that it is systemic racism that is causing the education disparity today. Well, we challenge that, because if we were able to, as Blacks, close the education gap in between 1920 and 1940, there must be other reasons for the education gap today other than race. That's the point. And a lot of our curriculum gives evidence to support that premise.
So I enjoyed looking through the curriculum, and maybe where did the expression "the real McCoy" come from? I never knew this before.
Yes, Elijah McCoy was born of fugitive slave parents. They escaped from Alabama and made their way to Canada, and where he was born. And he went to a school, and he went to college and got a degree in engineering. Well, in 1848, he came back to America and sought a job at the Chicago rail yards. But because he was Black, they gave him the most dangerous and the lowliest job, and that is physically putting oil on the wheels of trains. Well, he used his talent and his skills, and he invented a machine that goes around the wheel that automatically lubricates the wheel, and became wealthy. And there were others who tried to develop knockoffs, and the owners of the railroad said, no, we want the real McCoy.
That's a great story, and it's one that I didn't know until I started looking through your materials. One of the events in our history that I personally was not as aware of as I feel I should have been, and maybe my own education was remiss, but we just recently commemorated the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Riots. You have a lesson on that as well. What's the gist of that lesson?
Yeah, again, the premise of 1619 is that the economic wealth disparities today is a direct legacy of slavery and discrimination, and therefore blacks were never given access to banks, blacks were not given access to capital, and that's why. And so what we do is we document the fact that during the time of segregation, that blacks had their own pool of capital. They were in the churches. They're called burial society. And in places like Tulsa, Oklahoma, we created our own Black Wall Street. From the end of slavery up until 1920s, blacks in every major city created their own Wall Street. Chicago, for instance, in the Bronzeville section of Chicago in 1929, there were 731 black-owned businesses. We had $100 million in real estate assets at a time when we could not borrow money from the banks. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, we developed banks, insurance company, bowling alleys. And the reason that and we had 5 men who owned their own private planes in 1929. And so it was important for this. And so the Black Wall Street in Tulsa was the envy of white Tulsa because it was more economically prosperous than white Tulsa. And because of that, it was burned down. Hundreds of people were killed. And so that's called the Tulsa Massacre. And so when the retelling of that, the naysayers, I call them crucifixionists. All they talk about is the fact that it was destroyed, but they don't talk about why it was destroyed, what was destroyed, but also it was rebuilt. Within 5 years, the rebuilding process reestablished the Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Durham, North Carolina also had a prosperous Wall Street. The median income in 1940 of blacks in Durham, North Carolina was comparable to the median income of whites throughout the country. There's so many facts like this in our curriculum. The fact that in the first 3 weeks, we had about 15,000 downloads. Now today, I understand that we have 20,000 downloads for our 14 lessons.
Now, I mean, I've been through it a little bit. I signed up and told your website that I wanted to review the materials, and they let me in. But I imagine, homeschooling parents that want to access this high quality material are going to probably have to spend a fortune to get to it, right?
No, sir. All of our material is free. It's free to the public because we want people to be excited about it. We want them to be inspired by it. We want them to be armed with the knowledge to push back against the race grievance industry that is trying to destroy and trying to divide us.
Well, Bob, you seem to have a very sunny and optimistic disposition. How did you come by that?
Well, because all of my life I have been blessed to serve low-income people. I tell people 80% of my closest friends have letters in front of their names, like X something, not in the back of their names. And it's marvelous to work with young people who used to be predators, but thanks to God's grace, they became redeemed and transformed. And in fact, I have a book called Lessons from the Least of These, where I had an opportunity to follow the path towards redemption and witness firsthand how redemption occurs, when it occurs, and who is responsible and how it's responsible. So what I try to do is use whatever skills that I have is to write about the exciting path towards transformation undertaken not only by people in the past, but people in the present. They are what I call applying old values to a new vision. And I say that America doesn't have a race problem, it has a grace problem. because people that I write about, even though they suffered slavery, we had some people in Robert Smalls, who was born a slave and who commandeered a supply ship and turned it over to the Union Navy and was rewarded. Congress gave him $1,500. He became wealthy, a member of Congress during Reconstruction, and went back and purchased a plantation on which he was a slave and took in and cared for the wife and children of the slave master that had become destitute. There is an example of radical grace in action. So it isn't just a political and economic issues, but it is an example of redemption, of forgiveness. That's a part of the American ethos as well. It's not just redemption and achieving against the odds, but it's Dr. King mimicked the same act of grace. And so that's a part of the American story. Grace in action is a part that defines not race grievance, but we should study grace in action.
So the studying American history, warts and all, is still kind of a redemptive thing if you believe in the American dream and American exceptionalism. And it seems that you're really tapping into that, and also into a real sense of faith that we have better days ahead.
We really do, because I really believe that America is we're at a crossroads. We can choose chaos or community. But the real trauma that is facing us, the real issues, have little to do with race. America is in a moral and spiritual freefall that is consuming our children. In urban centers, the leading cause of death is homicide. Among Appalachian and low-income families, it's prescription drugs. Among people in Silicon Valley, the suicide rate for its teenagers is 6 times the national average. So it's not helpful to say that they suffer from white privilege when somebody has lost their daughter. So what we're trying to do, we're trying to de-racialize race and desegregate poverty. We must take race off of the table as something that separates us so that we can come together. In fact, the Woodson Center is right as we speak, or reaching out to moms in Appalachia, reaching out to moms in Silicon Valley to see if we can't bring a coalition of them together to sit at the table and discuss ways that we can help fill that emptiness that is in the hearts of our children, that's causing them to devalue their lives to the point where they want to take their own or take someone else's. That's the real challenge that we face. But we can't meet that challenge if we are forever divided by race.
Now your board and you wrote a letter from 1776 Unites, an open letter to the National School Boards Association and local school boards. Tell us about the letter, what it says, and what's the response been to that letter?
Well, the letter is making a case. Educators should get back to educating kids. That's what they should do. And when the emphasis is on equity, that disadvantage everybody. We should be striving for equal opportunity. In other words, American education is failing all children, regardless of race and regardless of income. So we're saying that we should measure our success not against races, but against a standard of excellence from 0 to 100. And so we're trying to get us back to where we used to be in America, where we emphasize character, where we emphasize the 3 R's. You know, to talk about raising the level of incompetence. That's all they're talking about. We have a crisis in educating, and we need to be drawing on the best of what we do. So we're asking the school boards to scrap this critical race theory, abandon this whole divisive issue of race and get back to teaching our children how to read and write and to think.
You mentioned critical race. Well, so let's get back to my second question there. What's the response been to your letter from school boards and others?
Well, it's been silent so far, but we've heard a lot from parent groups. We've heard a lot from parents groups. We've had some people actually run for the school board based on the information that we've got. In fact, one of our scholars won a race in New York, based on the information that he obtained. Ian Rowe, one of our Pelham, he lives in Pelham, New York, when he just won a school board race there. So parents are really utilizing it, and we're hearing back from them, but we're still waiting to hear back from the school boards. Well, I must say, there were two in Ohio. When Ian testified there, they actually withdrew the 1619 and replaced it with 1776.
Well, that's a hopeful response.
Yes, and we got 2 or 3 other state school boards have requested our scholars come and give testimony. So we're really hopeful that we are moving the needle.
So you've been in this business for a long time. Did the 1619 project and critical race theory kind of come up pretty fast and take you by surprise like it did me?
It really did. I was shocked. I know it has been discussed in the academy for decades, but it really was just some abstract discussions. But I think with the George Floyd and the other combination of things, it really took off. And it's really like a virus that is creeping into every aspect. I was shocked to see the Naval Academy, West Point, corporations are embracing it in the name of equity. I have to echo what my friend said, that white America should stop helping us. And I also say that when I speak to white audiences, I tell them that one of the helpful things that I can do, I have become a self-certified racial exorcist. So my hope is that I can just wave my hand and it will be done. But some of it, we have to laugh at it. But we also must push back. And so freedom-loving Americans and people who love this nation as I do, and I'm sure and your listeners do, we have to come together and really push back against this assault on our fundamental values as a country. You have school teachers who are refusing to teach the children the Star-Spangled Banner. There are all kinds of acts of desecration of our standards. But so we have to push back, and the Woodson Center is trying to provide leadership. For instance, 80% of Blacks surveyed are against defunding the police. 60% of Blacks surveyed do not believe racial discrimination is a principal barrier to their path forward. But you would never know this because the elites who are driving this assault assumed to be speaking for all Blacks. I can assure your listeners, they do not. They are a minority voice. You do not see Black Lives Matter flags flying in low-income Black neighborhoods. They're only on progressive churches, but not on Black churches either.
Now, I know you have some thoughts about critical race theory and an article you wrote. I just want to quote one sentence and then have you respond. Across the country, a handful of educators and administrators aren't really teaching kids about CRT. Some are applying CRT to curricula as a framework to understand the world. And this is what leads to ridiculous practices, such as separating children by race or teaching that a child or parent is privileged or an oppressor. I pulled that from an article that you wrote recently in A Better Way to Fight Critical Race Theory. Tell us some more about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's really taking on some ridiculous expressions. In certain cities, actually, the superintendent is having separate faculty meetings, blacks in on one room, white teachers on another. They're asking children to step up by how they appear on the power line. If you're white, you're privileged, even though you may live in Appalachia. In some of the poorest communities, you are defined. And in some cities, they're saying if you are a biracial child, you should condemn the white side of your family. I mean, it's taking on absolutely ridiculous expressions that is really destroying relationships with children. Anytime you generalize about a group of people and then try to apply remedies, it always helps those at the top at the expense of the bottom, those at the bottom. And what I mean by that, you cannot generalize about anyone by race. It is character that defines relationships. And the school systems are doing just the opposite. In fact, I said in another statement, I prefer the old-fashioned bigotry. I prefer the bigotry where it is obvious, it is external, it is in direct opposition. But this new form of bigotry is more insidious because it masquerades as social justice reform. I say it's almost like the difference between someone who is an announced enemy as opposed to someone who betrays you as a member of your family or your own community. When that happens in war, it's called treason. And I think there are people committing moral treason by masquerading racism as somehow helpful reforms that's going to improve the quality of life in America. That's why I said I would prefer old-fashioned bigotry. It announces itself, it's obvious, but with this new form is most insidious because it is clothed in good intentions.
Well, it seems to me that the work of the Woodson Center, and especially in this 1776 Unites curriculum, you are taking a very affirmative step of action to provide an antidote, or maybe even, I mean, more than an antidote, a completely different path. Am I right about that?
No, you're right. I'm trying to get us back to what Dr. King talked about, and that is freedom and justice for all. That our challenge is to help America live up to its promise. That the civil rights movement was a movement of inclusion. It was not a movement of exclusion. It was promoting justice for all. But there are people who are trying to push us to a pre-civil rights America, where we are resegregating ourselves and redefining ourselves by race. That's what they're trying to push us back to, and we must push back against it.
Well, going back in your long career in this area, how do you see the future, next couple of years, next decade? What's your vision for how this is all going to pan out?
There are two responses to that. First of all, I believe that the sickest part of the body draws the strongest antibodies. And that's a fact, physiological fact. And I think that the people who are fighting, trying to destroy this country, have overstepped their hand. And Bishop Sheen, I listened to a speech he gave 50 years ago where he actually predicted that once you take God out of the equation, America is in a moral and spiritual freefall. But he said something that I think applies here. But he said that the American eagle is a symbol of America, and the eagle nests high in the mountains. And when a certain points, the eaglets get to a certain point, in their growth, the feathers are taken out of the nest and the eaglets are pushed out and they begin to fall. Just before they crash, the mother snatches it up and takes it back up to the top and repeats this until the eaglet learns to fly. And Bishop Sheen said, America is crashing to the earth, but God is going to lift her up, take her back to the top of the mountain so that she can learn how to fly. And I'm optimistic because I really see, I'm really heartened by the backlash against 1619 that I'm witnessing. Parents, black, white, brown, are getting much more aggressive in pushing back against this assault on our nation's values. We're pushing back against those forces who would even say to the men and women who are been tasked with defending our nation, the Army, the Navy, the military should look upon the nation they're asked to sacrifice their life as being incurably racist. Who would want to risk their lives to defend a country that they're saying is racist? Who would want to be a first responder or police officer defending people domestically if the nation that they're being asked to defend is incurably racist? So we're on a real dangerous track by some people who, some are ill-informed, and our messages are really for the ill-informed. But for those that are ill-intentioned, our message will mean nothing. But I'd love to believe that most of Americans who are participating and supporting critical race theory are just misinformed.
Now, you recommend that children, especially older children, should be taught about critical race theory and what it means, but that schools should not apply that indoctrination to the curriculum.
Right.
And that's an important distinction.
It really is. I think the moment it begins to violate the civil rights laws, when they begin to separate children and require, they ought to be sanctioned and prevented from violating the law. But I think the way that you destroy an infection is hold it up to the sunlight. Let's let it compete with our curriculum. Let's let the sunshine of truth shine on it. And let the children compare. What does a society look like if critical race theory were to be applied? Tell me what kind of society would it create? And I can tell you from what we've written in the past, what kind of society we will create if you embrace freedom and justice for all. Justice where we judge people by the content of our character and not the color of our skin. So I just think we need to let them compare themselves. What is the consequence of embracing things? Because I really believe experience will always trump an argument. But when I'm debating this with people, man, I try to ask them, tell me what success looks like. If we were to apply the principles that you articulate, tell me what the world looks like.
Well, and it appears that you have provided parents and schools with real practical kind of solutions to address those questions as well. And I've been through the curriculum. There's a lot of material with each lesson, including PowerPoint presentations and worksheets and all of these fascinating stories that I think will illuminate and enlighten anybody who delves into it. Now, you say you have 14 lessons currently. Are there more in the works?
Oh, yeah. We're cranking them out every month. We're going to eventually have K through 12.
Wow.
And it's fascinating. We have not only the schools using them, but we have some of our grassroots leaders that are run reentry programs of women coming out of prison. And we had a wonderful presentation about one of our grassroots leaders who are using the curriculum to educate and inform and enlighten women coming out of prison. We have another pastor who's doing the same thing with people in community. So the curriculum isn't just K through 12, but they're rich, inspiring stories that can be applied to non-educational venues.
Well, as Vice President of Homeschool Legal Defense, I have been watching with great interest of late and the rise in the number of Black Americans who are choosing homeschooling as an educational alternative. And it just strikes me that whether you want to teach about this or, for any homeschooling family, this curriculum provides not just free, but really high quality. And I mean, I think your personality shines through the curriculum, which is a really good thing in this time in our country. I think we all need to have, lift up our eyes to look to the hills where our help comes from. And you and your curriculum certainly do that in ways that are practical, and I don't know, it's just so incredibly optimistic and positive in every way. So, Bob, I want to leave the last word for you about your work at the Woodson Center, your curriculum, or your outlook for the future.
Well, like I said, I'm incurably optimistic because this nation of ours is the most wonderful place. People of color, people are risking their lives to get here. They're coming by the thousands. And they're not coming to vote. They're coming for the opportunity that it offers. And so I am blessed that God has given me the responsibility to serve the least of these. And I'm just delighted that the Woodson Center is poised and is doing its best to do that. And thank you for this opportunity, Jim.
Well, thank you. My guest is Bob Woodson, who is the founder and president of the Woodson Center. The curriculum is 1776 Unites, which can be found at 1776unites.com. And remarkably, it is absolutely free of charge. And I can promise you, I've been through it. You won't be disappointed if you use it as teaching materials in your homeschool, or even just to augment your own understanding of the positive outlook of our American heritage. You can find out more about Homeschool Legal Defense Association by visiting us at our website, hslda.org. And once again, thank you to my guest, Bob Woodson. Really, really interesting conversation.
Thank you.
Today's program is made possible by HSLDA's legal support team. We know homeschooling isn't always easy. That's why we're committed to giving you peace of mind so you can focus on giving your kids the best possible education. As an HSLDA member, you have access to customized legal advice from our team of attorneys to help you comply with your state's homeschool law. And we'll represent you if your right to homeschool is ever challenged, even in court. Every day, we help our members respond to overreaching officials, and we stand ready to defend your homeschool against unlawful attacks. To learn more about how you can enjoy a worry-free homeschool experience, visit hslda.org/join. That's hslda.org/join. Thanks for listening to this episode of Homeschool Talks. If you enjoyed this conversation, leave a review to let us know what you think. To hear more conversations like this one, be sure to subscribe to this podcast or head on over to hslda.org/podcast for more inspiring stories and awesome ideas about homeschooling. That's all for today. We hope you enjoyed the program, and we'll see you next time.